Right now, beneath the streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco, two of the most studied fault systems on the planet have quietly crossed a threshold that scientists have been watching for decades. The southern San Andreas Fault, the one responsible for what most people simply call the Big One, has now gone 169 years without a major rupture. Its average recurrence interval is 150 to 200 years. The Hayward Fault, running directly beneath Oakland, Berkeley, and Fremont, has gone 158 years since its last major earthquake, against an average recurrence interval of 150 to 160 years. In plain terms, both of California's most dangerous urban faults have now reached or passed the point in their historical cycle where the next major earthquake becomes due. The USGS puts the probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake somewhere in California at over 99% within the next 30 years. Not likely, not probable, over 99%. Today we're going to break down exactly what the 2026 seismic hazard assessment actually says, which faults pose the greatest threat, what the official disaster scenarios predict, and why so much of California remains underprepared despite living with some of the best earthquake science in the world. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Before we get into it, I want to know something. If you live in California, or you've ever visited, did you know the numbers we're about to cover, or did this catch you off guard the way it catches most people off guard? Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. If you want to be the first to know every time something significant shifts in this data, subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, and it genuinely helps this channel keep going. Let's go for 5,000 likes on this one so the algorithm shows it to the people who actually live on top of these faults and have never seen these numbers laid out this clearly. Thank you. Now, let's get into it. California sits directly on top of the boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, two enormous slabs of the Earth's crust grinding past each other at a combined rate of roughly 33 to 46 millimeters per year. That grinding motion is the San Andreas Fault system, a network stretching 1,200 kilometers, or about 750 miles, from the Salton Sea in the south to Cape Mendocino in the north. But the San Andreas is only the headline. Beneath California's major cities lies a genuinely dense web of additional fault systems: the Hayward Fault, the Calaveras Fault, the San Jacinto Fault, the Newport-Inglewood Fault, and blind thrust faults like Puente Hills that don't even reach the surface, all capable of producing earthquakes strong enough to be genuinely catastrophic on their own. Let's start with the fault most people have actually heard of, the southern segment of the San Andreas. This segment runs from San Bernardino through the Coachella Valley to the Salton Sea, and its last major rupture was the Fort Tejon earthquake on January 9, 1857, an estimated magnitude 7.9. That was 169 years ago. Based on paleoseismic evidence, geologists estimate this segment has an average recurrence interval of 150 to 200 years for earthquakes of this size, which means, depending on which end of that range you use, this fault has either just reached its typical cycle or has already run past it. Scientists estimate the fault has accumulated somewhere around 5 to 6 meters of slip deficit since 1857, essentially stored energy waiting to be released. The official USGS shakeout scenario, a detailed disaster planning model built specifically around a magnitude 7.8 southern San Andreas rupture, projects roughly 1,800 deaths, up to 53,000 injuries requiring hospitalization, more than 300,000 buildings severely damaged, and around 500,000 residents displaced in the short term. Direct economic losses are estimated at over $200 billion in 2008 figures, likely closer to $300 billion in today's dollars. The scenario also projects roughly 1,600 fires igniting in the immediate aftermath, with as many as 200 of those growing into major conflagrations, largely because ruptured gas lines and damaged water systems make firefighting dramatically harder exactly when it's needed most. Now let's go north, to a fault that many scientists consider even more dangerous in the near term, not because it's bigger, but because of exactly where it sits. The Hayward Fault runs for 90 kilometers directly beneath some of the most densely populated parts of the East Bay, Berkeley, Oakland, Hayward, and Fremont, an area home to roughly 2.8 million people within just 5 kilometers of the fault trace. Unlike the San Andreas, which mostly runs through less densely populated terrain along much of its length, the Hayward Fault runs essentially straight through the middle of a major metropolitan area. Its last major rupture was October 21, 1868, an earthquake that became known as the Great San Francisco Earthquake of 1868, decades before the far more famous 1906 quake. That was 158 years ago. Its average recurrence interval, based on paleoseismic studies, is 150 to 160 years. That means the Hayward Fault sits at somewhere between 99 and 105% of its typical cycle, which is exactly why USGS scientists have publicly identified it as the highest near-term risk urban fault in the entire United States. The official disaster planning model for this fault, known as the Hayward scenario, projects a magnitude 7.0 rupture, causing around 800 deaths in the main shock alone, rising past 1,000 when aftershocks and fire-related deaths are included, along with 18,000 serious injuries and more than 400,000 people displaced immediately after the event. Direct economic losses are estimated at $82 billion, with an additional $41 billion in business interruption losses, stretching out over 2.5 years of recovery. It's worth pausing here to explain what these recurrence intervals actually mean, because it's easy to misread them as some kind of countdown timer, and that's not how earthquake science actually works. An average recurrence interval is exactly that, an average calculated from the geological record of past earthquakes on a given fault segment. It is not a scheduled appointment. Most faults show variability of 50 to 100% around that average, meaning a fault with a 150-year average interval could genuinely go 100 years between quakes or 250. Or in rare cases, even longer. What elapsed time past the average interval actually tells scientists is that a fault has had more time to accumulate stress than it typically does before rupturing, which increases the probability of an eventual earthquake without providing any specific date. Think of it less like a scheduled event and more like stretching a rubber band. The longer you stretch it past its usual snapping point, the more likely it becomes that it snaps soon, but you genuinely cannot say exactly when. There's a third fault system worth understanding, because it doesn't behave like the other two at all, and it's arguably the least publicly understood major hazard in California. Beneath the Los Angeles basin lies a network of blind thrust faults, meaning faults that never actually break the surface. They remain buried entirely underground. The Puente Hills thrust is the most significant of these, a 40-kilometer fault dipping northward directly beneath downtown Los Angeles, Whittier, and Fullerton, capable of producing an earthquake in the magnitude 7.2 to 7.5 range. Scientists don't actually know when this fault last ruptured. Estimates suggest it could have been well over 1,000 years ago, which means there's no clear historical earthquake to compare against, no clean recurrence interval to calculate the way there is for the San Andreas or Hayward. What makes Puente Hills particularly concerning isn't its size relative to the big one scenario, its location. A blind thrust rupturing directly beneath the most densely populated part of Los Angeles, rather than dozens of kilometers away along the San Andreas, could produce shaking intensities in the urban core that rival or exceed the far larger southern San Andreas scenario, simply because the energy has so much less distance to travel before it reaches the buildings above. There's one more major fault worth understanding before we zoom out, because it doesn't get nearly the attention of the San Andreas or Hayward, despite being the most seismically active fault in all of Southern California. The San Jacinto fault zone runs 240 kilometers from San Bernardino down to the Mexican border, slipping at a rate of 12 to 15 millimeters per year, actually faster than the San Andreas itself. This fault has produced a magnitude 6 or greater earthquake roughly every 30 years throughout the historical record, including events in 1918, 1937, 1942, 1954, and 1968. It's currently capable of producing a magnitude 7.0 to 7.4 earthquake, and scientists have raised a specific concern that goes beyond San Jacinto's own direct damage potential, the possibility that a major rupture here could transfer stress onto the southern San Andreas itself, potentially helping trigger the very rupture we spent the last several minutes describing. This is a genuinely important detail because it illustrates that these fault systems aren't operating in complete isolation from one another. They're mechanically connected across a shared, stressed crust, and activity on one can genuinely influence the timeline of another. It's also worth understanding just how much California's building codes have evolved specifically in response to past disasters, because the state's current seismic standards weren't designed proactively so much as they were forced into existence by tragedy. The 1933 Long Beach earthquake, which killed 120 people, led directly to the Field Act and Riley Act, the first real seismic building requirements in California, mandating earthquake-resistant design for public schools. The 1971 San Fernando earthquake led to the Hospital Seismic Safety Act, requiring hospitals specifically to remain functional after a major quake. Since a hospital that collapses or loses power in the exact moment it's needed, most represents a uniquely dangerous kind of failure. And the 1994 Northridge earthquake exposed a serious flaw in how steel moment frame buildings had been designed for decades, leading to a complete overhaul of welded steel connection standards still in use today. Modern California buildings constructed under current code, particularly in the highest seismic design categories covering Los Angeles, San Francisco, and most of the coastal areas, are engineered specifically to survive a design basis earthquake without collapsing, even if they sustain significant damage in the process. The challenge, as we mentioned, is the enormous inventory of older buildings constructed before these lessons were learned, buildings that predate the very codes designed to prevent the failures that built those codes in the first place. Zoom out across the entire state, and the statewide picture is even starker than any single fault. Under the USGS Unified California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, known as UCERF3, the probability of a magnitude of 6.7 or greater earthquake somewhere in California within the next 30 years exceeds 99%, which scientists describe not as a prediction, but essentially a near mathematical certainty based on 150 years of instrumental seismology, combined with millennia of paleoseismic evidence and continuous GPS measurements of the plates grinding past each other. The probability of a magnitude 7.0 or greater sits at roughly 75%, a 3 in 4 chance. Even a magnitude 8.0 or greater, primarily associated with a full southern San Andreas rupture, carries a 7% probability over that same 30-year window, roughly a 1 in 14 chance. Broken down regionally, the San Francisco Bay Area carries a 72% chance of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake in the next 30 years, while Southern California as a whole sits at 97%, spread across the San Andreas, San Jacinto, Elsinore, and several offshore fault systems. Here's where the story becomes less about geology and more about human choices, because California's relationship with this risk is genuinely a paradox. This is a state with some of the most advanced seismic building codes on the planet, a functioning earthquake early warning system called ShakeAlert that can give residents anywhere from 0 to 90 seconds of warning before major shaking arrives, depending on their distance from the epicenter, and mandatory retrofit ordinances in cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco that have already strengthened thousands of the most dangerous building types. And yet, over 1 million buildings across California still predate modern seismic codes entirely. More than 10,000 unreinforced masonry buildings remain despite decades of retrofit ordinances. And perhaps most strikingly, only about 13% of California homeowners currently carry earthquake insurance, despite standard homeowners insurance explicitly excluding earthquake damage. That means the overwhelming majority of California homeowners are financially exposed to a hazard their own state's scientists rate as a near certainty within their lifetime. To understand why that insurance gap matters so much, consider a realistic scenario. A moderately damaged home worth $900,000, a fairly typical Bay Area value, sustains around $180,000 in earthquake damage. Cracked foundations, chimney collapse, structural cracking. Without earthquake insurance, that homeowner is entirely on their own. Standard homeowners insurance won't pay a cent toward earthquake damage. Federal disaster assistance through FEMA caps out at under $38,000, and that maximum is rarely actually reached. The only other option is an SBA disaster loan, which still has to be repaid with interest, effectively becoming a second mortgage stacked on top of a damaged home. With earthquake insurance through the California Earthquake Authority, even accounting for a typical 15% deductible, that same homeowner would still be looking at a substantial out-of-pocket cost. But the difference between total financial catastrophe and a difficult but survivable repair often comes down entirely to whether that policy existed in the first place. This is also where ShakeAlert genuinely matters, because it represents one of the only tools available that can act in the seconds between an earthquake starting and the worst shaking arriving. The system works by detecting the fast, relatively harmless P waves that arrive first, calculating the earthquake's location and expected magnitude within 5 to 10 seconds, and pushing an alert out before the slower, far more destructive S waves arrive. Depending on your distance from the epicenter, that can mean anywhere from a few seconds to over a minute and a half of warning. For a magnitude 7.8 southern San Andreas rupture centered in the Coachella Valley, residents in Los Angeles could receive 40 to 60 seconds of warning. In San Diego, as much as 60 to 90 seconds, enough time to drop, cover, and hold on, enough time for automated systems to slow trains, shut water valves, and stop surgeries in operating rooms. It won't prevent the earthquake. It can meaningfully change how many people are standing, walking, or driving, unprotected the moment the real shaking hits. Let's talk practically for a moment, because information without action is just anxiety, and this is a case where individual preparation genuinely changes outcomes. If you live anywhere along this fault network, whether that's the Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego, or even inland areas like the Central Valley that still experience meaningful shaking from distant large earthquakes, there are concrete steps that materially change your risk. Securing your water heater and tall furniture to wall studs prevents 2 of the most common sources of injury during shaking. Knowing where your gas shutoff valve is located matters enormously, since ruptured gas lines are a leading cause of post-earthquake fires, exactly the kind of secondary disaster that turned the 1906 San Francisco earthquake into the catastrophe most people actually remember. Keeping a genuine 72-hour emergency supply of water, food, and medication accounts for the real possibility that roads, power, and water service could all be disrupted simultaneously across an enormous area at once. And for homeowners specifically, seriously evaluating earthquake insurance, despite the real cost and the significant deductibles involved, is one of the only tools available for converting an unpredictable, potentially catastrophic financial loss into a bounded, survival one. At the end of the day, what the 2026 Seismic Hazard Assessment really shows is not a single countdown to one inevitable disaster. It's a genuinely enormous, interconnected network of faults, each capable of producing a major catastrophe on its own, sitting directly beneath tens of millions of people who have built an entire modern civilization on top of a boundary between two tectonic plates that have been grinding against each other for millions of years and show absolutely no sign of stopping. The southern San Andreas gets the headlines because of the sheer scale of a full rupture, but the Hayward Fault, sitting closer to its own historical trigger point, or blind thrust like Puente Hills, rupturing directly beneath a dense urban core, could each produce a disaster just as devastating in their own right. We'll keep tracking this data as new studies and updated probability models are released, because this is exactly the kind of slow-moving, statistically driven story that deserves ongoing coverage rather than a single headline. If this kind of grounded, fact-first breakdown is something you want more of, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making it. Let's try to hit 5,000 likes on this one together. Thank you so much for watching this. Stay curious, stay informed, and I will see you in the next one.